Okay, well, let's get started. I'm sure that a few more folks will join us as their schedules allow, but let's get going. We've got a very interesting conversation ahead of us, and I want to make sure that we make the most of everybody's time here with us this morning. So I'm Bev Atfield. I'm the Principal of Workplace Science at Jahmaal. I'm here in Vancouver with my colleague Jaden on the call with me, who'll be helping me navigate through the conversation on the technical side. And today's Conversations at Work is going to focus on speaking up about racism at work. And as we all know, racism has rushed to the forefront in the last months. It's something that I'm sure that, all Black, Indigenous, and people of color have faced most of their lives. And it has now suddenly just become something that the rest of us have become alarmingly aware of, and we must act to change. So that's why I'm really honored and privileged to be able to have this forum and this opportunity to lead this conversation. And I'm just really delighted to have three very special guests with me to help me guide the conversation, but also to add depth and understanding and learning to the conversation today. So I'd like to welcome Shawna Stewart, who is the Head of People and Operations at PostBeyond. She's joining us from Toronto. We have Vanessa Shaw, who is the founder of the Human Side of Tech, who's coming at us from San Francisco. And we have Jahmaal Marshall, who is the global lead for the International Justice Mission, and he is joining us from Washington, D.C., if I'm not mistaken, correct? So we've got a really amazing group of folks, in addition to all of our attendees here today, who all have something to contribute to this conversation. But the format for these events is really an open dialogue. It's not a webinar. We're not talking at you. We really want this to be something that everybody can be involved in, can share their thoughts, their ideas, and learn from each other. And especially with a topic like this one that is really prickly and difficult and uncomfortable and sensitive. Not many of us know how to talk about these things. We're not taught how to do that. So, we arrive in places, especially like the workplace, and we're lost, and that means that oftentimes we don't talk about it, or we don't address the injustice, and we just let things go by. And, like me, I don't consider myself to be racist, but I haven't been vocally anti-racist either. So I've had a very confronting experience over the last few months, and I've just had this real appetite to learn, and it's my responsibility to do that learning. So I'm really privileged that I can be leading a conversation like this. So in terms of the format of our event today, if you didn't attend our first one on July 23rd, this really is, like I said, an open dialogue. However, there are a number of us on the call today, so we need to be respectful and mindful of other people who are speaking, and we certainly don't want to be cross-talking and making sure that we're not having sidebar conversations that distract from the main thread of the conversation. So the three guests will be leading the conversation with me, but anyone is welcome to join in. And the best way to do that is to use the raise hand tool in Zoom. So you just raise your hand. Either Jaden or myself will notice that, and I will call on you to add in your contribution to the conversation. Or you can contribute in the chat. So feel free, if there's something that really jumps out at you, add your thoughts in there, and I'll be sure to join that with the conversation, or I'll call on you to further extrapolate on your thought. So also, if we could ask that if you'd like to have your camera on, that's fabulous, but you don't have to. But I will ask that if you're not speaking, please be on mute. That will just make sure that we reduce any of the other noise or external noise for the rest of us on the call. This call will be recorded, and we will share it with everybody on the call today, as well as those who couldn't be here. So feel free to take notes, but there will be a recording that you can take away and share with your colleagues or others who you think would take value from it. Okay, so specifically with this topic today, I did want to emphasize that we are trying to create a safe space for a very delicate conversation. And because of that, I will ask that everyone to just be a bit more mindful and respectful of others who are talking and sharing their opinions. We realize that some of the things that we're going to talk about today might be triggering for people, and I completely understand that. So I'm going to do my best to lead us through a very safe, enjoyable, hopefully, and constructive conversation. But it does need all of us to be mindful about others who are sharing their thoughts. And there are going to be some raw experiences shared today as well. So please bear that in mind when you're responding to other folks who are talking. So ahead of the call, we got some really amazing feedback and thoughts from people around what you wanted to get out of the event today. And I just wanted to take just 1 minute before we launch into the conversation around some of the things that people were hoping to either take away or contribute themselves to the conversation today. So Justin was hoping to join the call to get comfortable with uncomfortable conversations, and we're definitely going to touch on that today in some of the topics that we're going to address. Michael was wondering how to approach the issue when observing a colleague who is perhaps acting in a way that is racist or discriminatory, and absolutely, that is something that we all could learn how to do that. Gabby says she wants to be better at, be a better leader who uses their voice against racism. And we are going to talk about what the leadership mindset needs to be when you're acting in a way that is anti-racist. And then Catherine says, it's not only important to learn how to speak out yourself, but learning how to speak to employees and within the workplace context is very important. And we are going to be digging into the workplace dimension of this as well today. So thank you very much to everyone who gave us their thoughts ahead of the event. That was very helpful to us to frame the conversation today. Okay, so that's a lot of speaking from me, and I hope that that isn't going to be the case for the rest of the event because I want to hear from everybody else. So I'm going to kick off here with inviting each of our guests to just share with us a few of their experiences around how they've grappled with racism themselves, or an experience that they've had that really was shocking to them around either realizing that they were acting in a way that was racist, or having an attitude that they didn't even realize was acting in a racist way. And similarly, in the case of Shauna and Jahmaal, they're going to share with us some examples of what it felt like to be on the receiving end of experiences like that. So Vanessa, could I ask you to start us off with just helping us understand what brought you here today and why this is such a passionate topic for you?
Yeah. Well, thank you for kicking us off. And before this conversation, Jahmaal, Shawna, myself, and Bev talked, and I posed, I said, how can I be a support person? And they asked if I would share a story about how, what racism looks like in the workplace and my own personal experience with it. And so in that sense, as a white person, I'm the offender. And one of the first things that I learned when I was in college that really triggered me, and I felt very defensive. I didn't have the terminology at the time, but it would be characterized as white fragility, was when I learned this concept of all white people are racist. And for a lot of folks, that's really confusing because we associate being racist with a lot of different things. And we said, but other races can be bigoted or biased or have negative ideas about other groups. But given the way white supremacy works, the only people that can be actual racists are white people. And when I learned that, I was really confused because I had been raised to appreciate different cultures and different perspectives and life experiences. But I didn't understand what I was supposed to do with that information. And now, about 15 years later, it makes complete sense. I mean, over that time, I've been continuing to reflect on that. And so I'll have a really specific example. And so how can only white people be racist? It's because a white supremacist society, globe, world, country is built to benefit white people. Right. And so I am the recipient of that system of oppression and the privileges and benefits from that. And so that makes me racist. And so my work as a white person is to be actively anti-racist. That is the lifelong work I have to do to dismantle racism. And on Instagram, I saw recently a posting, I don't remember who from, but they had said, it's an important realization for white people to recognize that racism isn't something to empathize with people of color's experience in the world. Like, oh, I empathize with, wow, that must be so hard to deal with all the time. And pivoting to ownership of understanding it is a system that we built as white people to benefit white people, and it is my responsibility to take apart. So anyway, off my soapbox there. But that was the big ahas earlier in my life, that I am racist because I was taught to be, raised to be, even though I was raised in a household where, you know, we appreciated different cultures. We wanted to be equitable in how we treated different people. But anyway, so one specific example where I really screwed up and I was really disappointed in myself because I'd already started my journey into understanding racism and bias, was my first job out of college. I was being onboarded. I was having a meeting with the HR, a head of HR, and we were just talking. She was going through the employee handbook with me. And I'm from California, and I'd moved to New York to take this job. And I remember I'm like sitting in this really uncomfortable plastic chair, and I'm really dressed up because it's my first job, but it was a nonprofit and everybody else is in jeans. And I'm like trying to do my best, put my best face forward. I think it was the most formal clothing I ever wore to work ever in my career was that day. And she mentioned, the HR woman mentioned that that she was Puerto Rican American. She was born in the US, but her heritage was Puerto Rican. And I was like, oh, that's so cool. And I had been taught and raised, you know, be curious about cultures and be interested to learn about them. And so I was like, oh, that's so great. I'd love to learn more about Puerto Rican culture. You know, maybe you can like teach me some recipes and Puerto Rican food. And then the conversation got really uncomfortable. And she looked at me like, okay, right. And it was just this icy moment. And I realized I had made a mistake, but it took me some time to kind of grasp what had happened. So a couple days go by and I just could not forget this conversation. It was just ruminating in my brain. And I'm like, this is the head of HR. I've already really messed up. And I went to her office and I said, could I, you know, just have 10 minutes of your time? I want to talk about something I said during our last meeting. And I said, I really want to apologize. I stereotyped, I kind of put you in a box. I don't remember my exact words, but I remember saying and wanting to acknowledge that I had stereotyped her and made her into kind of what the, I don't know, media or, you know, like all Puerto Rican women love to cook and it's her job to teach me, a white person, about Puerto Rican culture. Like, she didn't sign up for that. She's just at work. And so I apologized and I said, that's not how I want to show up in the world. And that's not the type of person I want to be. And I know I really messed up and I just apologized. Well, fast forward to, I worked there for 3 years. And the thing is, like, in her family, she hates cooking. She would like talk about it all the time. Like, and it was just really reinforced to me about how being curious about different cultures, you can look at stereotypes and generalizations and not give individuals the opportunity to be their own unique self. And a lot of time in movies, like, white people are allowed to be all sorts of different characters, all different kinds of the complexity of the human experience. But people of color, a Puerto Rican person, a Black person in film and media and all of the things that are put in front of us, they're characterized as like one type of people. And so that was kind of one really powerful moment that I saw how that upbringing had influenced me. And I think the takeaway for me was being curious about different cultures is not sufficient. It sounds nice. It's like, I want to put a little bow on it. It's very cute. Like, I'm curious about cultures. But really it's about understanding the complexity and the context and power and privilege dynamics. And more importantly, I need to understand white culture and how it has been taught to me and what that looks like and how it comes across to others. And that's a lot of my work, is like, what does it mean to be white? And how does that show up in my life, in my work, in my words, in my biases? And how can I unlearn some of those things and be better about looking through the lens of other people? So that's my first offering to the conversation, and I'll stop there and pause there and pass the mic, so to speak.
Thanks, Vanessa. Maybe I'll ask Jahmaal to pick up from there with regards to his perspective and reflecting on your upbringing and you know, how for you it really started at home, your greater awareness of other people in the world around you.
Thanks, Bev, and thanks for everything you shared, Vanessa. Is everybody able to hear me okay? Always ask that when I come on to a call. Sweet. And so I, similar to Vanessa, grew up in a household that was very culturally balanced. It's one thing to be a brown person here in America and grow up just around brown people, but that wasn't the case coming up. So there was always a hunger to learn about different cultures, but also I was set in different environments. I went to a kindergarten, a preschool, a grade school that had every other culture. So I grew up seeing that. Originally, before coming to DC, was from LA. So that area back then was super, super diverse. And then coming here, it was super diverse. And then I went to a multicultural church. And so growing up, I had to be around other people constantly. And just the things that my mother and dad kept us involved in, kept us kids around so many other people. So that always was a hunger, like, okay, that person's different from me. I want to know, you know, about their culture. But also knowing that even as a brown person, I don't know everything. You know, that doesn't qualify me to have the corner on race relations. And Vanessa and I, we had a conversation last week. I think we were on the phone for like an hour and a half, you know. So knowing that even as a Black man in America, being a man of color does not mean in any way, shape, or form I know everything about someone who is South Asian, someone who is Asian, someone who is Puerto Rican, and someone who's even African. But coming to conversations on my own accord with a desire to learn more. And, you know, for me, working in primarily and predominantly white spaces, particularly at a nonprofit that I started working at in 2010, you know, I think I worked around people who were like kind of Vanessa was before she may have had her reckoning. Whereas I'm a counselor. My face typically tends to be very expressive, as you can probably already tell. And sometimes, since I'm always a thinker, I tend to like stare for long periods of time. Just when people are talking, kind of trying to get past the surface of what they're saying. And I was told by a manager that because I'm Black, that could be perceived as threatening, and that I would need to change that. And I didn't really know how to take that, but the way I received that was that because of by way of your ethnicity, you have to bring more to the table than your white counterparts. Whatever you are, you have to be more than or dial back who you are. And there was a instance once when you have to excuse the sirens. I am in DC. I came into a meeting we were having. It was a smaller nonprofit, so there were about 38 or 40 of us in the meeting. And the leader said, we don't do Black people time here. This is what I heard come into a space, and it was only another Black employee. Now, being who I am, who typically tends to be a little bit more on the bold side, a white employee came in behind me and I said, I guess we do now. So I typically don't shy away from it. And he said, touche, but the moment caught me off guard that I had to hear that. And my supervisor, who was under him, said the words in private, I'm really sorry you had to hear that. But he didn't have the boldness to confront his own manager on that. And so coming on the side of the fact that a room full of people and you have someone who is 2 levels under you to say that, you know, it was really, at the time, I don't even know if I was hurt, much less so it was caught off guard. But being in an environment like that for 7 years, it was mostly microaggressions. And microaggressions, some of which I wasn't even aware of. But being around people who were, you know, a majority, to say things and not even realize their ignorance. And it hardened something in me, but not so much to the point where there's an unlove there, or not seeing, even my side of it, knowing that there's things that I'm ignorant about of other cultures. But that had been part of my experience. And I don't know who all is on this call and what everybody's background is, but it was also, because I have to be careful, especially these days, about how I speak about the church, because the church is kind of under a lot of fire. I'm a Christian. And the fact that it was a Christian nonprofit was really disheartening, because I expected more from people who are people of faith. I expected a lot more. And to know that people would name a name such as Christ and feel like it's okay to do those things, it was pretty hurtful. So that was just part of my experience coming up in primarily, white spaces, and a lot of times feeling like even if I told a joke, if people were gonna really get this, or having to explain every joke, so it's just like, this is exhausting. I could get their jokes, but it's like they didn't get mine, and it's like, oh man. And I'm not playing the victim. I'm expecting anybody to feel sorry for me. I'm just sharing with y'all the experience as it happens. So I'll pass the mic now, because I know we want to move this conversation along.
Thanks, Jahmaal. And yeah, you were touching on a few things there that we are going to get into a little later around the boldness and the courage to speak up, which is very, very hard, and it takes guts to do that. So thank you for raising that. And then also the macroaggressions that you mentioned. We are going to talk about that through the context of leadership and how leaders need to be getting on top of and fighting against those microaggressions. So thank you for sharing that. Shawna, can I hand it over to you now to give us your perspective and just perhaps share your experience? I know you've been very, I'd like to say elegantly vocal, but yet forceful on social media that I've recently seen, and I've really appreciated the way that you've approached the topic of racism at work. So could you give us just a few minutes of your experience and background?
Yeah, I mean, even just listening to Jahmaal talk about his experience, I get anxious thinking about it. I'm just like, again. It's frustrating, when you hear these stories and you can relate. I can relate specifically. And, I do have a hard time sharing my personal experiences, not, partly because I don't want to trigger myself, but the other part would be, as Vanessa was saying, like, we don't want people to empathize with us specifically. We want them to understand what is right and wrong. And if they do their own research and dig a little further, they will find that fire in their belly to see that this is wrong and that they need to fight against it. They don't need my story specifically to give them that ammo. So I am very careful about that. And I think, I'm thinking back to what Vanessa was saying about, white people being racist and, the ways that she was reared and things that she saw in the media. And, that's things that I've seen as well, right? And we've all seen. And so that does make us all racist. In some ways, I am racist too, because these are things that I've grown up to see, and I've judged other people on those same principles. And I know that I'm guilty of doing that. And I think that's why everyone needs to have this conversation. Black people, Indigenous people of color, everyone needs to have this conversation and have a reckoning of their own to see this is bigger than us. And this is the first time that we've actually been able to step outside of our bubble, of our own lane, and actually say, okay, what are the experiences of other people, and how do my actions impact those people? How can I look inward and learn about what they're experiencing so I can make sure that me being around them makes them feel safe? But I will talk a little bit about, that being said, I will talk a little bit about my upbringing and, just as Jahmaal was saying, kind of being in white spaces. And I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, and that is just because my mother stretched us really, really far to get us there. And, we were, growing up in the hood. If anyone knows Flemington Park in Toronto, that growing up there in the 80s and 90s is not an ideal situation. And so she really worked hard to get us out of that space. And so she moved us to a white neighborhood in the suburbs of Ajax, wanting us to have a little bit of a better opportunity, a better life, but we were still poor. So there was that element. So now you're in a white neighborhood, you're trying to do the things that the white is right and try to fit in there, but you can't dress like those people. You can't, really appear to blend in as much as you'd like to. And so, I had a lot of issues growing up in that environment and wanting to, change my appearance to reflect that, to blend into that. I wanted to dress like them. I wanted my hair to be straight like them. I wanted to just appear as white as possible so that I could, have a better chance. And, my mom thought I was being bullied and all of these things. And that's why I wanted to do all these things. But really it was racism, right? It was them feeling like I was different from them, and me trying to look more like them and talk like them and be like them so that I could blend in a little bit. And that's how I conducted myself throughout my life and in my career, and doing everything I could to dim my color so that I could make those white people that I work with feel more comfortable. A lot of people that I work with hadn't seen my hair curly the whole time I've worked with them, because that wasn't something I was comfortable having my hair out in an afro. I wasn't comfortable doing those things until these reckonings started happening. And I started to think, well, you know what? I'm Black. Everything I do in my life, as I navigate through this life and through society, I'm judged on that fact. So I should be my authentic self. And I start to see that happening in my community. I start to see that happening at work with my Black colleagues. And I'm really, really proud of that. And I'm really happy to see that that's happening. Because when Vanessa, you're sharing your story and you're thinking outside of yourself and thinking about how do I unlearn and how do I rectify and correct these biases, this is important individual work that needs to be done. And Jahmaal, for yourself, the same thing. Like you're looking at yourself and saying, I could learn a lot more about other people, about myself, about my background. And these are important conversations, and I'm really, really proud to see that we're on this call talking about this. But I'll pass it back to you, Bev, because I know we have more we want to talk about, and I'm excited.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you for sharing those experiences. And we're going to launch now into digging into 3 areas that when we did our pre-conversation before we came on the call today, we were thinking about how do we really harness the power of this conversation, specifically in the context of the workplace. And there's really 3 areas. There's the individual responsibility, there's the leadership mindset, and then there's the workplace environment. So we're going to spend the balance of the time here, and we're going to open it up for more contribution in those three areas. And I think the first one around individual responsibility is, from each of the stories that Vanessa and Jahmaal and Shawna shared, what's at the heart of that is this very individual personal experience. And that comes to bear in the workplace too. We all have an individual responsibility, not only to address our own concerns and fears and stigmas around racism, but we have an individual responsibility to speak up. And each of our own personal experiences, and I grew up in South Africa in the midst of the tail end of apartheid, and I consider myself as someone who was well versed in race issues, but I realized over the past months that I have no clue. So I've had my own reckoning and my own needing to deal with this, and as I'm sure everybody else on the call has at one time or another, or perhaps it's still coming for you. But what's at the heart of that is, if we're going to be able to make meaningful change, it needs to start with individuals. And that means each of us has a responsibility. So let's have a conversation about what that actually means. And where do we find the tools to actually make this individual change that we need to make? Because it's not up to Black people or other people of color to teach white people how to change this. That's unreasonable. And if that's what you think, then there in and of itself is a bigger problem, right? So maybe Shawna, you started touching on this idea of being your authentic self. And so that's part of individual responsibility as well, right? Is to actually be accepting of who you are and embrace that and be fully who you are. But that's easier said than done, isn't it?
Yes, I think, for a long time, my whole life, let me just be honest, it's been about self-preservation. And a lot of Black people feel this way, that, hey, we have to deal with it. We're dealing with it. We just kind of, brush it off our shoulders. That's how we were raised too. Like, you got to work twice as hard, or if you're a woman and you're Black, on top of that, my mother said, you got to work 3 times as hard to try and get to their level, because that's just the way society works, right? And so it wasn't until the most recent, after the death of George Floyd, that we started to see people come out of their shell a little bit. And we talked a bit about this with the way that I've been speaking out on LinkedIn, and trying to encourage leaders to talk to their team members. If they've hired Black people, they need to support them. They need to step up and say, hey, I see you. And I've been very vocal about that. I think, that's something that's really important. But that was something that I went through myself, where I thought to myself, is this something that I hide behind Instagram and my personal accounts and just kind of deal with it on my own? Or is this something that we should be talking about on LinkedIn and in professional spaces and corporate spaces that have been putting us in a box and saying church and state is very separate? But I mean, for all the people leaders on here, who are in the 21st century, you realize now that we're talking about how we treat our employees now. We're talking about talent management, and we're talking about giving them perks so that they want to keep working for your organization. So if we're starting to unravel that and say people matter, then we have to look past that church and state conversation and say, okay, if people matter because we want them to, have, we look at their mental wellness and we look at these things, we have to also see them for who they are in their backgrounds. So that means church and state is just something you've made up, and we've got to get past that and actually say, okay, you're a Black person, and I don't understand what that means. Like, just as Vanessa was saying, I don't understand what that means. She doesn't know the experience of the Black person, or the lived experience of Black people. So it has to be taught in an organization. It has to be taught to each individual who works at an organization. If you're going to hire Black people, which I hope most organizations will be doing, or if they haven't, that, that's something that they're looking at, right? But this is the shift, the transition to, okay, this is a private matter, this is a personal matter, I'm going to share it on my Facebook with my 50 people I'm friends with, versus I'm going to share it on my LinkedIn, and us as a company, we're going to share it on LinkedIn and say, this is what we're doing to support everyone, and say that we stand in solidarity with the Black community. So I think that's a big shift, and that happened on the individual level.
Yeah, thanks, Shawna. And Vanessa, maybe I'll hand it over to you to just, can we talk a little bit about having the courage to speak up? Because through your experience, you've been very open, and it's very raw, and it was a very difficult phase that you've been through and are still going through probably. But how do you get the courage to actually say, no, this is enough, we must speak up about this? How can we help everyone here understand that?
Well, I mean, I think a couple things come to mind. One is I've seen myself, and generally white people, who start to address and understand their own contribution or participation or complacency, and then get really motivated and say, like, I'm going to be an ally, I'm going to be outspoken, I'm going to speak up. And that can be misguided too. So I think word of warning I would offer is, one, and this is actually something more recently, I definitely referred to myself as a social justice ally and anti-racist ally. And the term ally gets used a lot, and allyship is important, but I also want to be cautious, because I think we kind of crown ourselves with, like, I'm the ally, when we're all still imperfect and learning and figuring it out. And really, it's not about some kind of personal identity, like, hey, look at me, now I'm an ally, because it's a lifelong journey that I know I personally will be on, and I will continue to make mistakes. And so it's not like a finish line, like, well, now I've evolved, now I'm an ally. So I just want to put that out there. So we talk at work about allyship. I see a lot of companies having trainings on allyship, and I would err on the side of allyship as a verb versus a noun that you place over somebody. And then on the other piece, I was in a conversation where a Black woman who was a friend of mine it was on social media where all the best conversations happen, right, about race. And there was a white woman who was really kind of denying the experience of this Black woman who's my friend. And they were going back and forth, and I was seeing it all happen, and I was concerned about my friend. And I messaged her privately and I say, do you want me to jump in here and speak up and speak out? I'm not liking the way she's talking to you. I feel like I'm imagining it's really triggering for you, and I'm concerned about your well-being. And she said, no, I don't want you to intervene. Like, thank you for checking in. And in a previous part of my life, I definitely have been like, I'm going to step in and like guard or protect my friend or this person of color, and I know what they need. I'm an ally, so I'm going to speak out. And I learned that, you know, don't assume what somebody needs, you know, check in with them. And so there's this concept of white saviorism, right? And so I want to be conscious of that. And so I think that's kind of some missteps that I've had, where I think I'm doing the right thing. I think I'm being anti-racist. I think I'm being the good person, the good white person who's speaking out, when really I'm just participating in another version or flavor of being oppressive, because I'm not letting that person, you know, have a choice. Once I intervene and turn it into a debate or whatever, then I didn't give that person a choice. So that's one thing. I mean, sometimes the situation does call for like, hey, I'm going to intervene here, or I'd like to pause us, or I'd like to slow us down, or whatever. But I think being careful to not speak on behalf of a person of color or a Black person, you know, and assume what they're needing in that moment. So that's kind of some of the learnings I've had to further, I guess, continue to improve how I act as an anti-racist, or what allyship at work could look like, and not stifling somebody's voice. Maybe they're like, no, let me handle it. This is like, I don't want you to, you know, make it all about you proving yourself and waving your, like, I'm an ally flag, look at me, I'm cool. And then also a woman yesterday wrote about how don't go and share on LinkedIn, hey, look at this cool moment at work where I acted as an ally. I saved this person, you know, by saying or speaking up. Like, don't do that. Don't be that person, which it's been happening quite a bit.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. Is there anyone around the table, so to speak, that might be willing to share a misstep that they made, or an individual learning or sense of imperfection that you might be willing to share with the rest of us, specifically around the individual responsibility that we have to speak up? Okay, well, I think we'll move on then into, because I know we're trying to pack a lot into a short space of time, and this topic is far more complex than an hour can do it justice. But let's move into the realm of leadership. And you know, everyone in an organization has the potential to be a leader, but let's look at this in terms specifically of people who are in leadership positions. So managers, team leaders, senior C-suite executives. What is their responsibility around, you know, first of all, addressing their own individual responsibility to change the way they think, but also in terms of creating spaces for people where it's safe to speak out about racism, and the practices and the way that teams conduct themselves are welcoming and inclusive and non-discriminatory. So Jahmaal, maybe I'll ask you to lead us just in a short conversation around the area of microaggressions that you raised when you did your intro, and really what that does in terms of creating these spaces where people don't feel safe to be themselves or show up in an authentic way.
Thanks, Bev. Yeah, like when that's repeated, that behavior is repeated, it sends a message to you, and you kind of typically, no matter what your ethnicity may be, you start to shrink back from that, and you start to mirror what you see. And so also, you know, from a policy or a process standpoint, it affects your performance. And it affected mine, because I didn't, you know, especially early on, I didn't really know exactly how to carry myself. It's like, okay, don't be myself, and be what is acceptable, but I'm not sure what is acceptable. And not really knowing how to speak to that because I'm hearing this from my own manager. Now, this was in the past. This was from 2010 to, let's say, early 2017. I will say this, in the organization I'm with now, back here in the DC area, when I came onto the team, my manager approached me with these things. I was just there to work, happy to do my job. She started asking me, how's your experience been here? And I want to make sure that you are comfortable working here so we get everything out of you so you can bring the 110% that I see the potential in you of. And she began to engage me with conversations about ethnicity and race. And I was just like, in a sense, it almost made me uncomfortable, but it's like, wow, it created a space for me to put my best foot forward, instead of feeling like I had to shrink back. It made it an environment where I could thrive instead of before where I was surviving. And when you're surviving, what you're doing the whole time is you're looking for a way out. That's what survivors do. Thrivers, they find a way to scale. They find a way to push things forward. They find a way to bring even new ideas and nuances to what they're doing. I'm not saying that word right, to actually increase the vision of the company or the organization. What survivors do is they use their lunch breaks to find a way to get say, how can I get out of here? Because I can't bring my best foot forward. So to answer your question, from a leadership standpoint, is actually confronting that very thing, like having those conversations right away. It happened right away as soon as I came onto the team, in a way where I felt like, wow. And because I wasn't even looking at things from a color standpoint. I just wanted to work. And she was like, well, we're in an international organization. You're going to be dealing with a lot of different people. And I deal with the global community. So even me knowing for myself, learning how to understand them. In a conversation I had earlier with Vanessa, I work with all of Asia Pacific. Chiang Mai and Bangkok are very different from the Philippines and Cebu. They're just very different cultures. And so me learning, I can't presume that all Asian people are like, all Hispanic people, all Middle Eastern people, all Black people. Even from Africa, from Uganda to Ghana, very, very different. And so when I came onto a team and those differences and all of us were celebrated, and all of us, my manager's South Asian, one of my coworkers is Asian, I'm Black, one of them is white, we're all different. So we're always, in a sense, rubbing those, those wheels are always spinning every day for all of us. But that wasn't the case before. It was very toxic. And, hearing from, I even heard from a leader, when I normally get out the shower, my hair is very curly, but I started picking it out in 2012, and I heard, I'd never seen your hair this nappy. Yeah, that was quite an experience, probably set aside for later in this conversation, but I didn't know what to do with that, And so in that toxic environment, it kind of starts to beat you down and affects your performance. And I believe when I came onto this other team, the manager saw like, there's potential there. And a lot of times for managers and leaders, they need to see that no matter what a person's ethnicity or background, or if they're man or female, that I'm hired them on, I want their best potential. They're not just filling a space. So even, in the whole area of diversity and inclusion, I just need to hire more Black and brown and indigenous people. Do you want to see that person thrive, or are you just checking a box? Because to Vanessa's point, real solidarity and long-term solidarity to always be sustainable. If you're just checking a box to say, I'm down with the cause, you are doing a disservice. Even if you just feel the space, you can feel the whole C-suite with Black people. If they can't thrive in that environment, they're going to get out of there. Brown people, Asian people as well. I've seen it happen. And so part of it is being comfortable with having uncomfortable conversations and starting there. When you don't start there, you know what I'm saying? You already kind of create the environment where people are unsure and don't know, where to come in. And I spent years just being unsure. And in a sense, instead of having authentic conversations with my manager, end up having sidebar conversations, not gossip, because that can be very dangerous in the workplace, but with other people who I thought could just get me. And they weren't even inside of my workplace. And so again, I just want to bring things full circle. That brings people into your environment who are, they're just coming and passing time. And that's a lot of what I was doing. So I hope that answered your question in a sense of right away, as soon as managers are bringing people on and making decisions and hiring decisions, think about having that conversation and how do I broach this with this person? What is the wisest way to have these conversations about getting to know them and all that they are, and also preparing them to serve people who look different from them, because we'll all be put in that position at some point or another.
Yeah, thanks, Jahmaal. You raised a few key things there for me. The first being around stereotypes and how as leaders we need to dismantle those and make sure that we are aware of them and working towards breaking that down in our teams and in our organizations. The second piece is around lip service and how, that's kind of related to just checking the box, right? Like you've actually got to do the work and take the action and be authentic in how you are taking that action. So Shawna, maybe I'll ask you to talk a little bit about authentic leadership and what that looks like to you through the lens of race and racism at work.
Yeah, I think I'm really happy that that's your experience, Jahmaal. And, I think that a lot of people, especially people on this call or people interested in how these conversations will happen at work, are thinking, well, what do I say? What do I do in response to this wave through this, Black Lives Matter at work? Is it something that I address head on, or do I have, private conversations, or do I just not bring it up because it's just going to make everybody feel awkward? And my advice to all the leaders out there is to talk to your teams, talk to everyone, not just Black people, but especially Black people. And just as Vanessa was saying, like reaching out and saying, like, do you want me to intervene, or reaching out in general, even if they don't take you up on the offer to talk about it, is still powerful because you're showing them that you see them. And that's something we've never had before. And that can help with people's healing, because Black people are going through a lot of trauma right now. And there's a lot of things that are being triggered and brought up and all of that. And so having that conversation, and not just one time, not just like, hey, I saw George Floyd, died and there's a lot of stuff going on. You okay? And then never talking about it again. That's not productive. You're having one-on-ones, ask them how they're doing, how they're feeling, how is everything with what's going on with Black Lives Matter? Have you been involved? If you don't want me to talk about this, let me know, but I care about you and I want to check in with you. And I think that's where it needs to start, those conversations, making sure that people feel comfortable and feel safe to have those conversations. And it will help leaders to peel back that layer of, this is awkward. Because once you start talking about it, it normalizes it, right? Now it's just something everyone's talking about. And that goes for non-Black people as well, because non-Black people are also getting all of the same media and seeing all of the same posts and trying to unlearn and educate themselves. And they want to feel that, safe at work to talk about this as well, right? And so talking to them and saying, how are you feeling about everything that's going on right now? Do you have people in your life that are, responding negatively to everything they're seeing, and how is that going, and how's that conversation going? And I think once you start having those conversations at work, then it's like the next step is, okay, so what can we do as an organization? We're doing the work internally. What can we do as an organization now to branch out to those communities, to show that we support those communities, and not just this one time, but from an ongoing standpoint, just as we were saying, like solidarity until the end of our time, right? And our goal here is to work to better humanity, and so that the next generations and the generations after that don't have to have these hard conversations. They'll have conversations, but they don't have to be as hard if we do the work now.
Yeah, thank you for raising that, Shauna. It reminds me of, right after George Floyd's death, where a number of very visible brands came out on social media, and everybody was posting their black square, and it was just a sort of an empty promise. There was nothing that actually followed up with, well, what are you actually going to do to bring about meaningful change? You can say that you're against racism, but what are you actually doing about it? And I think that connects into what you're suggesting, that leaders need to be doing that enduring, ongoing work, right? It's not about just saying, okay, hey, how are you today? And then that's it, you're done. This is an ongoing thing. And really, it's no different to any other aspect of how we should be caring for our people, and really empathizing and trying to understand each people's individual circumstance and conditions under which they're living, right? So there's a lot of work to be done. Thank you. I did have a question that that Glenn posed around. So he said, so you're saying that asking other people what they need to be their authentic selves in a given environment is worthwhile. He's concerned that if he asks someone for their input, it will make them feel like he's putting the onus on them to fix whatever the problem is. So Vanessa, Jahmaal, Shawna, anyone have a couple of words to respond to that? Like, how does that make people feel when you're sort of asking them? Or is that a good thing to ask?
I responded to Glenn privately, and I just shared that if you approach them with a desire that I want to learn, and I approach people with that same desire. Again, I admit my ignorance of other cultures. I don't know everything about Middle Eastern culture, Asian culture. To be honest, I don't know everything about African culture. It's so much, just like when Shaun was talking about the media earlier, there is so much ignorance that we are plastered with through here and here that we have to unlearn. And so when you approach someone with a desire to learn, it's more well received, where they don't feel like they need to educate you, but they'll take that journey with you. Hope that answers the question.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Jahmaal.
Sorry, just to add on.
Carry on, yeah.
I think what I've been seeing a lot and hearing a lot of is, Black people feeling like there's some intellectual theft happening, in that, in response to everything that was going on, the leadership team came to them and said, oh man, there's a lot going on out there. Can you solve this? You know stuff about your types of people. So, you've been talking about this for a long time, because there's a lot of people who've been talking about changing and trying to dismantle racism within their organizations way before George Floyd passed, right? So they go back to those people and say, hey, all of those newsletters you've been sending out, can you do one up for us in response to this real quick? And that's when it becomes an issue, because it's not about learning. They don't want to take the time to learn for themselves why they should do better. They want Black people to do the work for them. And that's when Black people are angry. And you see that on social media. There's a lot of angry Black people, which can be perceived as, bully culture or cancel culture and what have you. But they're just getting bombarded with all of this. Yeah, you do the work, you do the work, you do it, or you teach me, when if you need to learn something, you can just look it up, right? So I think having the conversation of I've been doing some unlearning and trying to educate myself and reform and all of this work, but I want to know, I want to talk to you about what next steps could look like. Do you mind having that conversation? If the person says no, don't feel discouraged. Don't feel like, wow, every Black person is going to say no to me. Just say, okay, whenever you're ready, or if that's not a thing for you, don't worry, I'm fine, I'll ask someone else. But make sure that you do ask someone else, because there are people who are willing to say, oh, I need to use your privilege, actually. Like, Bev, we're using your privilege right now to have this conversation, right? So those things need to happen. So keep asking those questions, Glenn, please. And don't shy away from that, as long as you're doing the work to try and educate yourself.
Real quick, I just want to chime in, and I think I shared this on our private call, and I'll be really fast in the interest of time. I have a friend who, I don't want to mention her name in the interest of confidentiality, but let's just say she knows more about Black American history than I know. I mean, she was telling me stuff about like Shirley Chisholm and Mary McLeod Bethune that I didn't even know of, like their private lives. And so I would just say, be willing to do the heavy lifting. And she, she's part of our small group, but she does the heavy lifting on her own. And when you approach the person, there's a chance that they may say no. There's a chance they may say yes. It just depends on what point of gestation you've caught them at. But already show that you've done some heavy lifting on your own, and you're not just coming in completely green with it. And if you are, and that's where you're on your journey, so be it. We're all green in different areas. But if you demonstrate a willingness that you've done and want to continue to do some heavy lifting, you can catch some allies. So.
Thank you, Jahmaal. Yeah, I think that it brings us back to what we talked about a little earlier around individual responsibility, right? And being prepared to do the heavy lifting is such a key part of that individual responsibility. And I know we're getting to the top of the hour here and we're going to have to wrap up, but we've tried to cover a lot of ground in this conversation, and we didn't quite get into the workplace dimension, but that's okay. I think we've touched on some really good areas that we can all go away and think about. And so maybe to wrap up, I'll Shawna, Vanessa, Jahmaal, I'll ask you quick 30 seconds. What's your one actionable tip for every person here today on the call that they can go away and think about and do right now? Because we really need to move to action. Like, it's one thing to talk, but we've got to move to action. So what will your one bit of advice be around how to embrace the individual responsibility? So Shawna, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, everyone I think is on different paths with where they are in this journey. But if you haven't had that conversation, like I was saying, from a leadership perspective, or even with colleagues, please do. Please just reach out to, Black people, people of color, and just have a conversation. Say, like, I'm learning a lot. I'm seeing a lot. I'm taking it in. I'm unlearning. I'm recognizing biases that I have. How do you feel about everything? And that will get the ball rolling. The more you start to do that, the more you'll normalize doing that. And it'll feel more like, okay, we're all in this together. And then you can make bigger steps forward together, as opposed to just trying to navigate and figure it out yourself. But start with the conversation. Start with the conversations at home as well, in your own household, with your kids, with your parents, your grandparents, because there's a lot of different opinions, a lot of different, a lot of different topics within this that will come up, and you'll learn a lot about your family in having these conversations. But I think it needs to happen on a personal level first, as the first point of action.
Thanks, Shawna. Vanessa?
I'm a podcast addict. There are some absolutely incredible podcasts, especially right now. I would say 1619 from the New York Times is really around, it's a good starting point. So go there first, maybe. Still Processing is 2 Black people from the United States talking about current events. And I've learned so much. So I would say, for one, there's no excuse to not be self-educating now. There's so many books, podcasts, resources. And I would almost kind of add a caveat to what you said, Shawna, and say, start with like some of the own kind of behind the scenes self-educating stuff before going and having conversations at work. And for white people, reach out to other white people and have conversations together about, I want to work on this. Like, how can we share some resources and have conversations together, and not putting all the responsibility on, like, for example, I had a friend say, oh, we want to do this thing at our company. We only have 1 Black person who works here. I want to run it by her real quick and see if like we got it right. And I was like, no. Hold, stop. That is, that's not her job. And so, like, let's rewind and pause for a second and figure out what you're doing before just running everything by, like, putting that emotional labor responsibility on people of color at your companies. So just being really cautious, like, if you're asking for more of their time, are you taking projects off of them? Are you hiring Black people who are, trained and want to be doing this work? Are you paying them for their time? Instead of just making it like, hey, you have to do all your normal job, and then on top of it, you have to educate our company how to get this right. That's an unfair responsibility to put on a person of color at your company. I'm happy to have conversations with anybody, so feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm not perfect, of course, but I'm more than happy to share what I've been able to learn over the years.
Thanks, Vanessa. Jahmaal, I'll get you to jump in real quick here so we can get everyone off to the rest of their days.
Gotta go rapid fire. There's a running theme, pretty much. If I were to start it, it starts at home. I did a post probably about a month and a half ago. It says, get your house in order. And it was kind of in response to the looting and rioting that a lot of people are going out and doing that have racist attitudes themselves, no matter what their color is, white, Black, brown, whatever. If you aren't correcting anything on the micro, don't look to go on the macro. It'll have very, very little authority. And that's all of us. That's everybody on this call, including myself and Shawna. If you have racist attitudes, look to correct it here first before you go out and correct it. And then from an HR standpoint and from a process standpoint, policy. Where can you do to get the little wins that lead to your company diversifying? Little wins will lead to big wins, but it has to start somewhere. So I would encourage it, start at home first, start inside first. And then when you go to the macro, begin to develop policy and processes within your company that actually invite long-lasting and sustainable diversity. And not just diversity of people, but also diversity of thought. So that's my quick 2 cents.
Thank you, Jahmaal.
And feel free to find me on LinkedIn.
That's a wonderful note to end on, and just like to extend my sincere thanks and gratitude to Shawna and Jahmaal and Vanessa for their courage and willingness to share and be part of our group of special guests for Conversations at Work today, and to everybody who came along to listen and think about and take these ideas and thoughts further. Because like I said, it's we're here speaking, but now it's time to get to work, and we know we've got a lot of work to do. So thanks for coming. Our next event is August 20. We are going to be speaking about one of the most important parts of conversation that is often forgotten, and that is listening. So please join us. You will get an email about it, and feel free to send some feedback about the event. I know we've gone a little bit longer than the hour, but thank you for being here, and thanks for being an important part of this conversation. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.